Hey film fans, welcome to CinePro, your ultimate hub for all movie recaps. From heartwarming classics to the latest blockbusters, humans thought they were not the only ones in the universe, so they decided to send an exploratory mission to space. They landed on a planet and discovered that apes were the rulers of the planet, treating humans like animals and oppressing them. What will happen next? This is a summary of the movie Planet of the Apes, 1968. We start with a space exploration mission with astronaut George, who sends a report to the base. The spacecraft carrying George left Earth 6 months ago, and those 6 months equated to 7 centuries on Earth. George is now in the year 2673, meaning the people he knew on Earth have already passed away. However, George wasn't concerned and wasn't regretful. All he wanted to know was whether there was life on another planet besides Earth. He says he hopes the person receiving his reports on Earth is a good person and that humans have become better people and stopped waging wars. George looks at the fellow astronauts with him, who are in a state of freezing and sleeping in capsules. George is the only one awake to operate the spacecraft, and there was a clock on the ship tracking time. We see the year 2673 displayed. George then goes into the capsule to sleep, and after a while, the spacecraft makes an emergency landing on an unknown planet, landing in water. The spacecraft crew wakes up after feeling the landing and discovers they slept longer than they had calculated. They are shocked to find their colleague Stewart dead, and then water starts entering the spacecraft, forcing the astronauts to exit, especially since they discover the atmosphere is breathable. They check the clock on the spacecraft and find it stopped at November 25th, 3978. They exit the spacecraft and sail in a lifeboat to the shore, surprised by the nature of this planet, as they don't see anyone living there. However, the planet has oxygen and an atmosphere suitable for human life. George tells his colleague they are 320 light-years away from Earth and currently on a planet within the Gemini constellation. But it's impossible to pinpoint the exact planet because no one managed to take reports, which was sinking. They reach the shore, and George manages to bring 3 bags from the spacecraft containing first aid supplies, food, and drink, enough for 3 days, and a bag with a gun. One of them, named London, asks how long a day here is compared to Earth. They talk about their deceased colleague Stewart, saying she likely died due to pressure loss. George mentions they've been flying for a year and a half, equivalent to 2,000 years on Earth, so there's no hope of returning, and even if they did, everything would have changed. They need to study this planet because they will live here. The third astronaut, named Dutch, analyzes the planet's atmosphere, revealing that plants can't grow due to low carbon dioxide, but the planet is still suitable for humans. They realize they only have 3 days before their food and drink run out, so they decide to explore the planet. Before leaving, London plants an American flag on the shore, and the astronauts set off on their journey. The surrounding environment is full of rocks and sand, with no sign of life. Suddenly, there are unexpected landslides, and they slip. Then, they see lightning and thunder in the sky, but strangely, it doesn't rain, even though the sky is cloudy and there are no visible stars. They spend their first day without finding anything and rest in their location, feeling discouraged. George talks to them, saying they are light years away from Earth, and even if they manage to return, they won't find their loved ones or the people they knew. He asks his colleague about the reason for embarking on this exploratory mission, whether it was for fame, science, or something else. George shares his reason, saying he believes there are other creatures in the universe besides humans, and he wants to see them in any form because they would be more advanced and civilized than the barbaric humans. Suddenly, Dutch calls them from afar, and George and London go to him. Dutch has discovered a small plant in the desert, indicating life on the planet. Since this plant exists, there must be many other plants. So the astronauts become enthusiastic and continue their journey. They find more plants and vegetation, but they also find strange X marks. Upon examining these marks, they discover a waterfall behind them. They celebrate, remove their clothes, and jump into the water, enjoying themselves. They return to dress, but they find footprints on the shore. Suddenly, they see someone stealing their clothes. So they chase after the thief, who leaves clear tracks behind. After a while, the astronauts find their clothes on the ground, but they are torn. They are forced to wear the torn clothes to cover themselves, and then they walk a bit further and find people behaving strangely, paying no attention to the astronauts, eating fruit. The astronauts are puzzled by their appearance and behavior because they act like animals and are very primitive. The astronauts are relieved that they are not cannibals but vegetarians. Suddenly, a strange sound comes from the forest. causing all these strange people to run. The astronauts want to understand what's happening. They see a horse with someone riding it, and several others appear on horseback, shooting guns. The riders turn out to be armed apes hunting humans, considering them animals. Humans run at full speed to save their lives, and the apes chase them, shooting. The astronauts get separated in the chaos, and a bullet hits Dutch, killing him. George manages to escape with the humans to a lake, but before he can jump in, an ape shoots him in the throat, causing him to faint. The apes capture George and the other humans they hunted, putting them in cages. We see the apes taking pictures with the captured humans. George and the other humans are taken to a hospital where the doctors examine George, especially since he was wearing strange clothes. The doctor examining George is a veterinarian, but he decides to examine another human and ignores George. George hasn't fully recovered from his neck injury, so he can't speak. We see that they are keeping humans in cages as if they were pets. The next morning, scientist Zira comes by. Zira is very surprised by George because he is different from the other humans. She calls him the animal with bright eyes. She noticed he behaved differently from the other primitive humans, and George tried to tell her he wasn't primitive. He tried to take paper and a pen from her to write something, but the guard hit him. Then he's taken to Dr. Zaius, and Zira shows him George, saying that this person is different from the other humans and seems smart and exceptional. She tells him to look at his clothes and how he stands and moves his hands, but Zaius is convinced that George is just pretending to be different. Zira disagrees with him and tells him to see how George wears the blanket like clothes. Zaius says all humans are dangerous creatures and should all be killed. They then put a girl in George's cell as a gift. The next day, they put George and the girl in another big cage. Zira brings her fiancé, Cornelius, to show him George. Cornelius is not impressed by George and sees him as a very primitive human with nothing special. While they talk, George writes on the sand to communicate, but no one notices. Later, Dr. Zaius comes, and they talk about George. Suddenly, one of the humans attacks George without reason, and the guard intervenes to stop the fight with fire. Zaius saw the words that George wrote on the sand. Strangely, he wiped the sand quickly. Zira visits George afterward and apologizes for what happened. Quickly, George grabs a paper and pen from her and writes his name, George Taylor. Zira is shocked by George's actions and even more surprised that he can write, so she takes him out of the cell and brings him to her house. Cornelius still doesn't believe that George can write and says humans are primitive and stupid and don't know how to read or write. He thinks it's a trick by George, but George writes in front of them to prove it. Cornelius asks him where he learned to write, and George writes the name of his school. Zira and Cornelius are shocked to see a smart human for the first time in their lives. It's like seeing a monkey writing in front of you, which would definitely surprise you. George tells them he is from another planet, and Cornelius is even more surprised because the apes believe no one can fly. George makes a kite and flies it for him, and Cornelius is impressed. Then George asks them to show him a map of the place. George explains on the map where he landed and how he got there. Zira and Cornelius talk and say that humans are a mix between apes and gorillas might have evolved genetically to become humans. Zaius enters and finds George with them, and also finds the kite. He crumples it and gets angry. Zaius orders that George be returned to his cell like the other animals. George indeed returns to the cell with the girl who was imprisoned with him, and he names her Nova. The guards then want to take George to another place, but George hits the guard and runs away, hiding in the ape temple. However, another ape sees him, so he runs again. George continues to escape and runs through the city, eventually reaching a museum where he sees humans preserved. George is shocked by the scene and then escapes to the street, but the guards throw a net over him and capture him. Finally, George regains his voice, and his vocal cords improve. The apes are shocked because they see a human speaking for the first time. The guards return George to the cell. There, George tries to teach Nova to speak, but the guards come in and spray them with water, separating the two. But the apes are smart and separate them so George can't talk to her. George and Nova are placed in adjacent cells, and George talks to Nova and tells her his story. He tells her he is from Earth, and that he was neither married nor in love with anyone. He asks her to be his girlfriend, and George manages to make Nova laugh. Then the guards arrive and put a collar around George's neck and take him to court to be tried for his escape. Zira and Cornelius arrive to defend George as if they were his lawyers, but the judges are annoyed by Zira and Cornelius's actions and say that humans are just animals with no rights. George tries to defend himself, but Zaius intervenes and attacks George, saying he is irrational and can't answer simple questions. George tries to answer Zaius's questions, but he fails because of the ape culture. Zaius prevents him from speaking and tells him to write what he wants to say and submit it to the judges. Cornelius reads what George wrote. George was saying that he was an astronaut and arrived from another planet, but the judiciary didn't believe this and asked to see the people who were with George in the spacecraft. They send George to the humans to find his companion. George manages to find London among them, but he looks strange, as if he has become primitive like them. London doesn't recognize George, and George finds a scar on London's head, realizing that Zaius performed brain surgery on London, making him backward. George is angry and wants to attack Zaius, but the guards capture him and drag him to court. Cornelius defends George again, saying George described the area where he landed accurately, proving he is indeed smart. Zira says all this evidence indicates George is from another planet or was born on this planet. She also tells them she previously dissected a human body and discovered that humans can't speak because they have a brain problem. But since George can speak, it shows he is smart, not stupid, and this is the truth they don't want to accept. The apes indeed refuse to listen and don't want to hear anyone defending humans. Zira and Cornelius accuse the ape system of intentionally keeping knowledge away from humans and wanting humans to remain ignorant and stupid for an unknown reason. The judges announce their final decision and decide to hand George over to Zaius for experiments and surgery. George wanted to ask the apes many questions for a long time and asks Zaius how they originated and, more importantly, why he is so afraid of him. But Zaius refuses to discuss with him and says humans must be eliminated. He tells George he will perform surgery on him in 6 hours and orders the guards to put him in the cell. Meanwhile, Zira is upset with the court's decision and sends a relative to help George and Nova escape from their cell. Zira's relative takes them to meet Zira and Cornelius gives them horses and some food. Cornelius decides that they should all go to the place where the spaceship is, and indeed, the 5 of them move and arrive. When George reaches the beach, he shaves his beard, and Cornelius tells George that he was an archaeologist and he wanted to show him the cave he was digging in. But at that moment, Zeus and his men arrive, and when George sees Zeus, he raises his weapon at him. Zeus negotiates with George, telling him if he can prove that humans are the origin of civilization and that they came from the apes, he will leave him alone. George agrees to this deal. They all enter the cave where Cornelius was digging for antiquities and indeed find human skulls and bones. They also find glasses and surgical tools that doctors used. Cornelius tells Zeus that maybe there was a civilization living before them that used metal. They discover a toy doll that says Mama, and George asks if there is an ape that can make a talking doll. This is evidence that humans are the origin of civilization, but George tries to find stronger evidence. Suddenly, they hear gunfire from outside. When George goes out, he finds that Zeus's men have broken the agreement. So George takes Zeus hostage and orders all the apes to leave, threatening to kill Zeus. George tells Zeus he will let him go if he gives him 2 horses for him and Nova, along with food and drink. Afterwards, he ties Zeus to a rock to humiliate him as he was humiliated. He asks him why he is afraid of him. Zeus confesses the reason he hated George from the beginning, saying he is afraid of him because he is human. Ancient humans are responsible for the planet's destruction, and humans are the most dangerous beings in the universe, willing to kill their brothers for a piece of land or for entertainment. George feels that he is right and decides to leave on his horse with Nova. But Zira tells him they have no idea where they will end up if they keep going because they haven't explored those lands yet. But George has no other place to go. He bids farewell to Zira and Cornelius, thanking them for their help. George warns Zeus before leaving not to follow him, threatening to kill him and his men with the rifle. Then he moves on with Nova. Zeus orders his men to capture Zira and Cornelius because they helped George escape, and also orders the destruction of the cave Cornelius found to erase any trace of human civilization. Meanwhile, George is walking with Nova by the sea, but suddenly George sees something that makes him get off the horse. George is shocked and can't believe what he sees, saying that humans indeed ruined and destroyed the planet. Nova sees that George is upset and shocked, but doesn't understand why he is so disturbed. We discover that George was looking at the Statue of Liberty, but it was destroyed. We understand that George and the astronauts didn't land on another planet. They landed on Earth, but 2,000 years later. This brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you did, make sure to subscribe for more awesome content. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you